So I hope you enjoyed the panel. I definitely did. It was super interesting, very insightful. And we're going to continue with these amazingly insightful talks here with Robert Barron. And Robert is an, please bear with me, SRE solutions engineer specializing in AI ops and chat ops at IBM. So welcome, Robert. Great to have you.
Great to be here.
And we were going to take a look at the Challenger disaster 35 years later. We're going to look at the lessons learned. And I don't even want to take up too much time because I just want to hear all about it and don't want to, please, if you're ready, go ahead.
So hello, everyone. My name is Robert. I'm from IBM. I've been working in the domain of operations and site reliability engineering for quite some time now. And I'm very lucky that my work sometimes merges with my hobbies and interests, which is the early days of space exploration. What I'm going to be talking about today is the Challenger disaster from 35 years ago and the very modern lessons that we can learn as SREs from what went wrong and how we could avoid similar situations ourselves.
Oh, Robert, you accidentally muted yourself.
Sorry, and I will purposely unmute myself. Thank you. Where were we in 1986? Well, NASA had had 25 years of very successful human spaceflight. From the very earliest days in the early 60s, where we didn't know what was going on when we went into space, to the moon landings in 1969 and the early 70s, the first space station, and the space shuttle itself in the early 80s. It had just been success after success. And to Americans and basically to everyone in the world, when you said NASA, it was just a code word for technological success. The level of success that they had was so high that they started thinking about, well, space is not just for highly trained astronauts specializing in going into space and training for years for their very first space flight. We want to make space available for everyone, make it universal, make it accessible, a part of regular life. And they decided that as an inspiration, the first regular person to be launched into space should be a teacher. And Krista McAuliffe was chosen to be a civilian in space and to deliver some lessons in space during her mission. And she would have only the basic training that any person could have. You don't need a degree in sciences. You don't need to be a test pilot in order to fly into space. But there were difficulties. If we start off, the original flight was planned for July of 1985, and for technical reasons was postponed to November, postponed to January, postponed again, and postponed again. And finally, it launched in January 28, 1986, 35 and a half years ago. And this happened to be, by coincidence, the very coldest weather Florida had had during a launch. This was exceptional weather, and quite a few engineers were worried that perhaps the shuttle would not function properly in these conditions. But they launched, and 73 seconds after launch, the space shuttle disintegrated mid-flight. And I'm going to take a break now from the presentation. Stop my sharing and try to illustrate to you using a prop. This is a Lego shuttle, which shows the different components. Here is the spacecraft itself, where the astronauts are. This is the fuel tank, the orange container full of the liquid oxygen, liquid nitrogen, which powers the space shuttle. And these are the solid rocket boosters, which support the initial launch of the space shuttle. And you can see here, even though this is a simple Lego model, it is realistic in some way, where you can see there's a flex here. This is not a solid tube, but it's made out of small pieces that are linked to each other. And the reason for this is so that when the shuttle goes up into space, they can flex a little bit and move. But the thing is that in order for them to flex, you need to be able to have something in the middle between the joints, which keeps them sealed, even though they're shifting and moving. And what they put here were rubber rings called O-rings, because the shape is of the letter O, which are between each of these segments, and they keep them sealed up so that the hot gas doesn't escape through the links in these different segments. But what happens when you have a rubber ring and you have freezing temperatures? When it gets cold, the rubber becomes less flexible. And that's exactly what happened. The rocket shifted a little bit. The rubber could not compensate for the gap that came up. And hot gases escaped from this rocket into what was next to the rocket, the tank of liquid oxygen. What happens when you have a lot of heat with liquid oxygen? You have an explosion. And that's exactly what you can see here. This is a video recording of the shuttle launch. In retrospect, during the postmortem, they came and saw. Here you can see the little flare of fire expanding till it bursts through into the container of liquid oxygen and burns up, and the shuttle disintegrates in flight. So why did this happen? Well, the simplest way to look at it, the trivial way, is to say, well, the shuttle was being postponed. It was the 5th postponement. The managers were embarrassed and not happy with this postponement. The engineers were just pressurized into launching now, even though they thought it was too cold to launch. But the reality is always a little more complicated. And let's look at the information that the engineers and managers had at the time of the launch. Why did the engineers say that they shouldn't launch? Because it was too cold. And they took their information from previous launches and said, well, we've noticed that when it gets cold, we've seen damage to the rubber rings, to the O-rings. And we think that the colder it gets, the more damage there'll be. And I'm oversimplifying for the purpose of this lightning talk, but this is basically the information they presented to the managers. And the managers said, well, yes, it does get damaged, but look, we had the most amount of damage when it was not particularly cold. So there's no real justification for postponing the launch, and we're going to go forward because you haven't proved that there's a problem. Now, if the engineers had slightly changed the information they presented, and, for example, included not just the flights that had had failures, but also the flights that had no failures, then we could see a better pattern showing that if it's above 15 degrees, in over 20 cases, there was no damage. We have 2 outliers here, but as a general, yes, we can more obviously see that if it's cold, there's more likely to be a problem. And if we take it a step further and add the temperature of the launch in 28th of January 1986, it had been it was 12 degrees colder than any other launch had ever been. And we can see that the potential damage is even higher than we had ever thought. So again, please don't take from this that the engineers had not presented the information correctly. I'm just showing you a very oversimplified vision and view of how the information was presented to management. The point is that not all the information was made available in a comprehensive way for the managers to be able to make a yes-no decision, but there was always interpretation of the data that needed to be made. So let's look at this in analyze this as a post-mortem from the design goals of the shuttle, which should never have failed, to the early flights. What was the process and the change which moved and made us in the situation where the failure was possible in the first place. Well, if we look at the design of the O-rings, the design of made in the 70s and early 80s, before the shuttle was ever launched, they were not supposed to be damaged at all, let alone fail in such a way that destroyed the spacecraft. So they were designed that they would be safe during launch, they would never suffer heat and never be damaged. And even if they were damaged, there was a redundancy built in so that if the unthinkable happens, we still have our redundancy and we have no problem. At the same time, the design goals of the shuttle was a very low mean time between flights. They wanted dozens of flights a year. They had a fleet of 4 space shuttles, and they wanted to be able to fly once every 2 weeks. In reality, well, we'll talk about reality in a moment. And the flights were supposed to be simple, easy deployments. After a shuttle lands, a short refurbishment, and then a relaunch. And of course, safety first. Even in the most standard flights that we take every day, safety always comes first. So what happened in reality? During some of the launches, they saw damage in the O-rings. The damage was not severe. It didn't reach the point where there was a failure and we needed redundancy. And the redundancy mechanism was completely undamaged. So something strange is going on here. The design says there should be no damage, but we are seeing some damage. But actually, we're capable of continuing even through this unexpected damage. From the perspective of the SLO that we were planning, 20, 30, 40 flights a year, they were managing less than a dozen flights a year. It was much more difficult to deploy the space shuttle than expected. It took much longer. It was much more expensive. So they were still pushing and still keeping safety first, but they were starting to be conscious that on the one hand, we're well behind schedule, we're not achieving our SLOs, and maybe we have some extra flexibility in the safety that we designed, because we've seen that we've gone beyond our design and we've had some unexpected failures and everything was fine. As we went on, approaching the fatal 25th flight, we saw more damage, but the damage never led to a failure. And while they knew that the issue was a problem and they knew they needed to fix it, they considered the risk to be managed, because despite the failure in the component, there was never a failure to the service. And they were getting more and more frustrated in their failures to deploy as fast as possible. And yes, safety is the most important thing, but let's start being reasonable. Obviously, we are managing this risk, so we can take some risks that we would never have considered back here when we were doing our design goals. But now we know much more, and we know that the damage doesn't lead to failure. Or at least that's what they thought. They thought they were managing the risk. They thought that everything was under control because this unexpected failure, which they knew about, was just a component failure and would never lead to a service failure. But it did. So this shift in the way they thought was called normalization of deviance by Diane Vaughan, a sociologist who did a lot of research and basically wrote the book on the Challenger disaster, where there was never a moment when someone said, let's take a risk. There was never a moment when someone said, let's take a shortcut in the process. It was a slow change in the consideration of what is normal. Is it in 1981, damage to the O-rings was considered to be impossible. In 1986, damage to O-rings was considered normal. The technology hadn't changed in the meantime, but our consideration of what is legitimate had changed. There was always pressure to launch as fast as possible. It wasn't the specific flight because it was postponed 5 times or because there was a civilian on the flight, and that's why the managers were so stressed. No, the management was always stressed. The engineers were always pressured to launch on time. This all led to a culture that slowly and unconsciously moved from a prove it's safe before we can deploy to prove that it's unsafe to stop a deployment. And handling the technical debt became much less important than launching a new mission on time, because they always thought that they were managing their technical debt and controlling the risks. And of course, we can take all these things as metaphors to what we're doing today in our CI/CD pipelines, because launching a space shuttle beyond the cloud is just like using a CI/CD pipeline to deploy a new application into the cloud. So if we look at our lessons, if you don't understand the design, if something unusual is happening, you can't really believe that you're understanding the risks properly. The pressure is never someone. It's never one person is causing the pressure, which is leading to the bad decisions. It's always the culture and the process of the organization, which is enabling this pressure to let people make mistakes. Culture is not something that you have in day one and then continues forever. Culture shifts and changes, and it can happen without you noticing at all. And handling technical debt can never be ignored because we have more important things to do, like deploying the next version. So I could continue, for hours on the subject. I'd like just to take a moment to remember the crew of Challenger: Scooby, Smith, McNear, Onizuka, Resnick, Jarvis, and McAuliffe. They should not have died. We should have had site reliability engineers in place to stop many of these things that happened. But it did happen, and we can learn lessons from that. I've got a number of SRE lessons that I publish on space. Most of them have much happier endings, like we managed to land on the moon despite all the problems that happened along the way. So thank you very much for being on this call with me. If you've got some time, pop over to the Instana booth, see their demonstration, try to win an Apple AirPod. And as I said, I work for IBM. I work on a product called Watson AI Ops, which is basically taking our artificial intelligence capabilities and putting them in the domain of operations and site reliability engineering. So thank you very much. I can't see or hear you, but I'm sure you've been a wonderful audience. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm also available, chatting, messaging, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was fantastic. Lots of stuff that I didn't know before. So thank you so much. Also from Ahmed in the chat, he says, amazing talk, Robert. As a space fan, I love it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Unfortunately, we won't have time for questions, but will you be around in the booth maybe, or?
Yeah, in the booth, there's the notification system for the conference. Yeah, also available in Flying Barron, Twitter, Medium, LinkedIn, and whatever.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone.
Thank you. And we will start with the next talk in a couple of minutes. I don't think we're going to make it by 5 with the Murphy's laws of observability. So see you in a bit.